Hi folks, we're going to do another video here about books, another booktube video. I have been tagged by Michael K. Vaughan and the tag is called The Faces of Horror, and it's 6 questions relating to different types of horror story. The tag was started by Vaughan at Plagued by Visions. I will link Michael's channel and Vaughan's channel down below. If you're interested in horror books, you should definitely check them out. They're really worth your attention. So let's jump right in. Question 1 of 6. A horror story that scared or disturbed you. I had real trouble thinking of one. Obviously I've planned out beforehand. I know what these questions are. I've given this some thought. I had real trouble finding one because things don't really scare me. I'm a very rational person. Horror is interesting as a genre and I do read horror books, but they don't really scare me. They're just entertaining. And then I ended up coming up with 3 different answers. First of all, I was going to cheat a little and I was going to pick Intruders by Bud Hopkins. Now, Intruders is not a novel or a story. It is a non-fiction book about alien abduction that I read in my mid-teens. And I've always had an interest in, well, let's talk about all 3 of these, right? So we'll talk about this one a little bit. I always had an interest in UFOs and various paranormal things growing up. And I don't know what I think about the alien abduction phenomenon nowadays, if I'm honest. But as a naive 15 or 16-year-old, there I was sitting in the school library after school reading this book. It was my habit, strange guy that I am, to go to the school library after school and do all my homework before going home. And then I wouldn't even go home. I would actually sit there and read a novel until 5 o'clock when they had to practically kick me out. I just loved it. I loved the atmosphere of the library. It was way up high. It had a view of mountains in the distance. Loved the ambience, and it was just so pleasurable every day to read, to finish my homework, to read, then to go home and realize the evening is mine. I have no further schoolwork to do. But going home required going out of the back of the school, or college technically, going out of the back and walking up this dirt path through a small field lined with hedges for probably not much more than 100 or 200 meters, which gets me to the main road, which is then very close to where I live. And normally that's fine. And it's maybe October, November, and it's getting pretty dark when I'm walking home. And normally that's fine, except I'm reading about alien abduction. And it's so funny now to think back on it. But because it wasn't, in my mind, it wasn't make-believe. That's the secret. I was invested in what I was reading. It felt rational. Talking about people who lived in like a cottage in the woods being abducted out of their beds in the middle of the night by a saucer-shaped craft hovering over their heads or whatever it was. And there I had to walk up this dirt track in the dark practically, even though it was only 200 meters. Couldn't do it. With this going through my head on this particular day, couldn't do it. I had to walk out of the front of the school and take a detour around normal roads with traffic, take a 1.5 mile or to 2 mile detour to get home, instead of walking along about 200 meters. Couldn't do it. So that's kind of funny to me to look back on. You may have had this kind of experience yourself. You know, if you're with your friends and you talk about, you know, strange things that have happened to you or ghost stories, it puts your mind in a funny headspace. And if you have to go walking home afterwards, it's pretty scary. Even though objectively the world is what it was. Your own subjective universe inside your head then sort of impinges upon the real world, if you know what I mean. It's interesting, isn't it? A really good horror novel can do that, but it very rarely happens. And for me, it took non-fiction. It took Bud Hopkins' Intruders. But that's not the one I'm going with. That was the first choice. Then it occurred to me I was going to talk about Crash. Not a scary book, but a disturbing book. Crash by J.G. Ballard. I read it prior to David Cronenberg's movie. It was always known as a sort of semi-science fiction, strange classic, and Ballard is known as a sci-fi writer who he has written various things like The Drowned World. I haven't read any more of his stuff, though I want to. But Crash was so darn weird, and it's essentially about a man who gets involved in a car crash, and it's pretty bad, but it has some effect on his consciousness in some weird way that he starts fetishizing car crashes as part of a sexual experience. And he finds a group of people who are into the same thing, right? Now I can't relate to that at all. And even weirder is that the main character, the protagonist, is called James Ballard in the story. So that's the author's name. I guess the J in J.G. Ballard is probably James, right? So is he writing something autobiographical, semi-autobiographical? I don't know. I just read this super weird book, and I kept thinking as I was reading it, it's going to make sense at the end. It didn't. David Cronenberg's movie was interesting. Seemed a little different from the book. I was still none the wiser. I've watched it a couple of times, and I get a little more out of it. And I do kind of like it. It's strange. It's a strange movie. Yeah. Disturbing? Yes. Because to me, sexuality is very much about intimacy and love. Whereas in this story, it was all about somehow using sex in conjunction with car accidents to somehow transcend or something. Yeah. I don't know what to make of it, but it definitely kind of weirded me out. Possibly more so than the likes of American Psycho, which was just kind of disgusting in places. Anyway, there's a few other titles I could pick, but here's the one we're going for. We're wasting too much time here. We're 7 minutes in, we haven't actually answered this question. Here's the one I'm going for. Some of you may not consider this a legitimate answer, but in terms of the definition of story and how I think about the book I'm about to tell you, I think it's a legitimate answer. The most disturbing story I have ever read is the book of Job from the Bible, right? And I do think of it as a story, not history. I used to think of it as history, and that's part of why it's disturbing. If you're not into the Bible, you should probably consider reading this just for your own entertainment anyway, because it's a very strange part of the Bible. The whole Old Testament, as you know, is about Israel, the nation of Israel, God's people, so-called. But Job, in the middle of the Old Testament, seems to stand apart. We don't really know who Job is. He seems to be a standalone character that has nothing to do with the nation of Israel, who kind of lives somewhere else. And yeah, there's going to be spoilers here because I want to kind of talk about it. But the story is about God and Satan. And Satan, you may not know this unless you've read the whole Bible. I have. Satan is almost entirely absent from the Old Testament. He's in the New quite a bit. But in the Old Testament, Job is really where you find him, and there's not much of a reference to him anywhere else. And it's actually Ha-Satan, the adversary. It's not even a name. So he's in the heavenly court, and God is there, and they have a conversation. And God is boasting about Job, his servant. And I'm paraphrasing here, but God basically says, check out Job, look at him. He's a righteous man, he serves me. You know, can't fault the guy. And Satan goes, yeah, but look, of course he has, because look at all you do for him. You know, he's got a great family, he's got all these riches, he's got his health. You know, naturally he's going to serve you, you know. You take all that away, it's going to be a different story. So God says, okay. And there are this happens 3 times in 3 different ways. I can't remember the order of them, but One of them is, okay, you can kill his sons, but spare his life. So Satan goes down, kills Job's sons. But Job does not curse God, right? The other one was, he goes down and destroys all his property, takes his flocks, kills all his flocks and stuff, so he loses his wealth. That one probably came first, okay? Still doesn't curse God. And then finally God says, okay, you can destroy his health, but spare his life. So Satan goes down and Job ends up covered in all these boils. So it's like, you're having a real bad day, right? Still he doesn't curse God. Although he does say, he does want to question God. Why is this happening to me? Why? Why have you done this? And Job's friends are saying, what? You must have done something really awful to offend God if this is happening to you. And he's going, no, I haven't done anything. And so basically, at the end of it all, Job does come face to face with God in a whirlwind. And he demands an explanation, something to that effect. And God basically says, who do you think you are? That's what it amounts to. I'm God, you're a creature. You can't possibly be right. And that's the only answer you're going to get. Right? And that, there's a kind of profundity to that, in the sense that, really, if there is a transcendental being who transcends time itself and space, you can't expect to be right. Even if the most terrible thing is happening to you, you can't expect to be right. You're just a creature bound by space-time. But this is not what was disturbing about this. Well, I was in another life, I was a committed Christian who looked upon the Bible as the authoritative Word of God. And it seemed that what this story was getting at, this actual account of something that happened to somebody in the past, I thought, what it's getting at is, if you're going to be a really spiritual person, a really righteous person, not that those two words these days mean the same thing to me, but anyway, if you're going to be a really good Christian, let's put it that way, then God's going to have his eye on you, and he's going to test that. He's going to test your mettle to see whether it's really going to stand. You see? So the thing that disturbed me was this idea that if I really start to make progress as a Christian, I better anticipate the hammer coming down on my life, because that's how God goes. That's how he works, right? I'm going to be tested. I don't know how, but it's going to be tested. And you're almost better just being a mediocre Christian. Let's just get through this life and get to heaven so that we don't have too much trouble in our lives. But it was always worrying to me that spiritual progress potentially meant your life turned into an absolute horror show. And I really believed that, and it really did a number on me. So the book of Job is the most disturbing thing I've ever read, because it paints God essentially as an abusive parent. And the thing that nobody notices when they read the book of Job, when you read the book of Job as a Christian, you always see yourself as potentially Job. You never see yourself as one of Job's kids, right? Who were essentially cannon fodder. God had his eye on Job. He was the important guy. And the kids were basically superfluous. They could die in the service of a spiritual lesson for their much more important father. So maybe, if there's any Christians watching, maybe you're not Job, potentially. Maybe your destiny is to be like one of Job's children. Maybe you've got a son, a daughter, a sister, a wife, a husband whom God has got his eye on. And you're going to have to die because God has a spiritual lesson to teach that other person. You see what I mean? See how perverse it all becomes in the mind when you try to take this stuff seriously? So the Bible to me is the most disturbing book I've ever read, and the book of Job is the most disturbing book within the Bible that I've read. Not Revelation, Job, right? So that's a few for you to chew on. That's question 1 finished. Don't worry, there aren't 3 options for every question because we're 15 minutes in. So the next one is a horror story that depressed you or made you cry. I had trouble thinking of one for this, and then it came to me and it was obvious. It's The Road by Cormac McCarthy. It didn't make me cry. I don't know if any book really ever has made me cry. I don't cry easily because I'm a man. Right? No. But The Road by Cormac McCarthy. Okay, so it's post-apocalypse. Possibly nuclear. It's not described in the book. And the story is all about a man and his young son traveling, trying to get to the coast, east or west coast of America, I guess. I can't remember which. And if you just picture a road with trees that are just bare of leaves, ash everywhere, most people are dead, and they're just traveling on foot with a little cart. And it's harrowing because they meet all kinds of people like cannibals and stuff like that. Narratively speaking, it's not a great novel. Also, it has some Deus Ex Machinas in it, in the sense that they find just what they need at just the right time, unexpectedly, to keep them surviving. And it's really just about them traveling and who they meet and what happens to them. And there doesn't seem to be any real hope, because I mean, okay, they're going to get to the coast, but what's there? There's nothing there really. So it's a pretty depressing read. But well, before I go on, you know, Cormac McCarthy's style as well. I have a hard time with his style. He's doing this thing where he won't put quotation marks around speech. They're just missing. It almost looks like reading a script sometimes, but he hasn't put the names of the people who are speaking, but you can kind of just guess as you're reading it. I don't even think there's any italics. It's very burr prose, and he has this really awful habit of saying, there's something happened, and then this happened, and then they did this, and then they were over there. And it's like a bunch of things strung together with multiple ands. And it seems like, I hate to say this, but it really reads like some poorly educated 14-year-old's homework or something like that. Except he has a really rich vocabulary, right? So I know that's not the case. I tell you what it really feels like. It really feels like Cormac McCarthy just kind of tossed this stuff out on his typewriter or whatever, and he figured, well, I've got an editor who will lick that into shape. He put the quotation marks in, and he'd lick it into shape, he'd put in the he said, she said stuff, and he'd change all that ands around to other things. And then the editor forgot, and it just got released the way it was. And I know that's not the case, but it really looks like that. I do not like Cormac McCarthy's style. But this book has something. And even though it really depressed me, I mean, I've read it twice. I've seen the movie twice as well. I read it before the movie came out. I remember going to the cinema with my friend Andrew, and it was almost empty. And this group of young people came in, young men and women, probably around 20 years old, maybe younger. They came in and they sat down, and they had their popcorn and their Coke and everything. And me and Andrew just looked at each other and sort of said, they've no idea what they've walked into. We knew because we'd read it. We could tell they were coming in to be entertained, and they had no idea what they'd walked into. And as far as I remember, they walked out at one point because it was probably too much for them. But here's the important thing. Here's what kind of redeems The Road for me. When I had finished it the second time, which was kind of like late last summer, I read it really fast, so my head was just sort of swimming with this novel. And I happened to go out for a bike ride through the countryside close to where I live. And the sun I could feel the sun on my face, the light breeze, I could smell the plants and just see the beauty around me of the countryside. And this juxtaposed with what I had just read, it really made me feel so grateful that the world was not like the way the world is in the road. It was quite a poignant evening, just having that little experience right after reading The Road. Yeah. So that's as close to a horror story that depressed me as I can get. The Road by Cormac McCarthy. Okay, the third one, a horror story that made you laugh. I've mentioned this one recently before in passing. It's got to be Rosemary's Baby by R11, which was a first read for me earlier this year. Saw the movie a couple of times in my life. Okay, there's going to be spoilers in this, but if you're looking at the picture, you can, it's like, it's over there, right? It's back to front on this thing. It's over there. I mean, the cover is a spoiler. The cover of the ebook version that I read is a spoiler in and of itself. So, Rosemary and Guy, recently married couple, they've moved into this building in New York, is it? This big building, and they become friends with the Castevets, who are their, an old couple who are their neighbours. But they're not, there's something a little off about them. So Rosemary ends up pregnant, and it's a happy occasion seemingly, but there's a kind of a weird sort of trippy scene the evening before Rosemary gets pregnant, and it seems that, well, it involves all kind of weird trippy things. But anyway, during this pregnancy she has all kinds of problems. The Castevets are kind of involved, giving her these strange drinks that are disgusting and insisting that she see a particular doctor, and she has suspicions about her husband too eventually, but all she can think is, I have to protect this baby. And there's so much suspense going on in this. We'll get to the funny bit, right? Because it's not a funny novel until it is, right? Basically, R11 has this great ability to portray the drama that Rosemary is going through very, very poignantly and accurately. You really do feel her plight as a vulnerable young woman, pregnant and alone, not knowing who to trust, and just having to try and get herself out of this situation that she's in. Until the very end, the pregnancy ends, the baby is lost, seemingly, and she's distraught about this. And then she can hear a baby through the wall, which is where the Castevet's apartment is. And she finds a way to sneak in. And they're there with her husband, with the baby. And this is where it gets funny, right? And she has suspected them of being witches, right? Long before this. But the baby is there, and it's got these yellow eyes with slit pupils. You don't see this in the movie, but it's described in the book. And there's a kind of power in the movie by not seeing it, but I think that was actually probably just a budgetary constraint. There's more going on in the ending, and the ending gives you more insight into what Rosemary's thinking and feeling. But she says, what did you do with its eyes? Or his eyes? What have you done with his eyes? And Roman Castevet says, he has his father's eyes. And she's like, whoa, what? Guy's eyes don't look like that. And of course, Satan is his father. She was impregnated not by her husband, but that whole trippy scene. Satan in the flesh, complete with horns and tail and everything else, the archetypal crazy depiction of Satan. They've actually managed to conjure Satan up here in the physical realm, and Satan wants a son. Rosemary is going to be the vessel to bring that son into the world, right? So it's just the horror of this. She realizes I gave birth to the son of Satan, and that's not really what's all that funny, even though it's like, it's totally farcical at this point, you know, but it's just hilarious. And it's the fact that they've taken this baby away from her, but she looks at the child and she starts rocking the cradle, and she starts falling in love with this part human, part demon child. And it's like, it's just bonkers, but it's so well written. And it's funny because it's like motherhood trumps everything. The love of a mother trumps everything, even if you've given birth to the son of Satan, right? And she's deciding, you know what? I'm going to guide him along the right path. And he's not going to be, you know, he's not going to turn out the way you want him to. So she's going to change the son of Satan. And it's got, I mean, it's, you can't see it in the movie, but he's got the little nubs here where the horns are going to grow, and he's got the tail, I think. So it's really fun. It's a great novel. I heard recently there's a sequel to it. I think it came out a good while ago now, but called Son of Rosemary, and it's about the child who's now like 30 years old. It hasn't been all that well received, not the way the original has, but I have a funny feeling I'm going to like it, because I can get on board with the farcical side and just think of it as a fun ride, because it ultimately is. You can't take this book seriously. You do the whole way along until the end, and then it's just, but somehow it just fits. So that's a horror story that made you laugh. Honourable mention, another book, maybe Night of the Crabs by Guy N. Smith. British horror writer, came to the fore in the 70s with the horror boom, the horror literature boom. He basically rode the coattails of James Herbert, who had written The Rats, and Sean Hudson would later write Slugs. So it's like, pick a small creature, make it monstrous, you know? So Night of the Crabs. It's really funny because the author tries to be sexy, but they come across, the scenes he writes come across unintentionally as like, it reads like a 15-year-old's perspective on what a sex scene should be. And the horror in it is really quite silly as well. The behaviour of the crabs. There's one called King Crab, who's like in charge of all the other, they're giant, you know, they're gigantic crabs. He's in charge of the other crabs. Do crabs even have some kind of hierarchy? And he's waving his pincers around in ways that communicate with the other crabs, and it just seems bizarre. But it was fun, unintentionally I think, funny by the author, but it kind of got me reading more Guy N. Smith, and I'll probably read some more at some point. Honourable mention, Night of the Crabs. Number 4, a horror story that made you angry. Yeah, I'm going to go with, well, here's the thing. I don't know of any book that has made me angry as part of the narrative, in terms of like, I'm so invested in what's going on that I'm angry about what's happening. But there are a couple of books where the author has made me angry about the story, where I'm thinking, why did you write it like this, right? And I'm going to go with a horror novel that I read when I was a Christian by a really popular Christian fiction author called Frank Peretti. And the novel is called This Present Darkness. There's also a sequel called Piercing the Darkness, which I'm not going to read ever. But I've heard Christians gushing about This Present Darkness. It's a really strange novel about a town. From what I can remember, there's a town and there's some kind of big battle going to be fought between angels and demons in the spirit realm above the town. And the prayers of the people give strength to the angels. And the demons are like typical sort of winged, fanged things. which is kind of silly. They're like straight out of a cartoon, you know. It's like reading it's like watching an episode of Thundercats or He-Man and the Masters of the Universe or something. But what really struck me about it was, from memory anyway, there are 0 casualties among the angels. They're running around with their big swords, dispatching these demons left, right and centre and just killing them. But the angels seem to be unkillable. And I'm thinking, this is just ridiculous. And there was one scene in particular where somebody was driving a car and a demon slashed his sword through the engine, which made the engine stop. And I'm thinking, oh, so if my car breaks down, that could be like a demon doing that, you know, because he was trying, you know, Frank Peretti was trying to write something that he considered possible in this sort of Christian belief system where angels and demons are considered real. But the whole thing was utterly farcical, and it just annoyed me. Even as a Christian writer, even as a Christian reader, it annoyed me. Another one that made me angry, didn't know which one to pick, so I'll talk about both of them. The Outsider by Stephen King, one of Stephen King's more recent novels. I loved the first half of the novel and hated the second. I will give you some details about it. This won't be too spoilery. But basically, there's a guy who's a baseball coach, and there is an event, a horrible event, where the body of a child is found. It has been the child has been sexually assaulted in a terrible way and murdered. And there's airtight evidence that it was this local football coach that did it. So the police go and they arrest this guy, and they make a big spectacle out of it while he's actually at a game, coaching at a game. But they then discover completely airtight evidence that this guy was in a completely different town on other business at the time of the murder. So I love this. It was like, it's going to be like a crime novel, I was thinking, you know. It's airtight evidence that he killed the boy, and airtight evidence that he was somewhere else. And I thought, oh man, Stephen King, this is great. Stephen King is going to pull something out of this that I just didn't see coming. I can't think how we're going to resolve this, you know, because it's like, wow, what's he going to do? And then I thought in the back of my head, surely he's not going to pull some trope like, because all I could think was, you know, okay, he's came back from the future, so there's 2 of him, one that murdered and one that didn't. Could be that. Or there's a clone of him somewhere. Couldn't say a twin, because it's like, you know, fingerprints would be different. Is there a clone of him somewhere? He's not going to do that, is he? Or is it going to be some kind of shape-changing monster that can mimic people? It's not going to be that, is it? That would be too commonplace. He wouldn't do that, would he? I'll leave it at that, shall I? Put it this way, it's a trope. He used a common trope, and halfway through the book, it all fell apart, and I plowed my way to the end, and it did not redeem itself, and I nearly stopped reading Stephen King as a result of reading that novel. I know some people really like it. I didn't. The Outsider almost killed my interest in Stephen King. So yeah, kind of made me angry. Number 5, a horror story that is important to you. Gonna go with, and this is a short story this time, The Last Day by Richard Matheson. I'll put up a picture of the short story collections that you can find it in, okay, if you're interested in reading this one. I mentioned it before, but I'm going to mention it again in a bit more detail and talk about why it's important to me. So basically, it's the last day on Earth because the world is going to be destroyed. It's not nuclear war. It's not something that can be avoided. It's something about the sun everything's heating up, I think, to the point where everybody's just going to die. There's no way to avoid this. It's the end of the world. The story kicks off with our protagonist, who's a man, not a middle-aged man, a young man. The story kicks off after a night of debauchery with him and his friends, and everybody's just, you know, hungover and everything. But this is the last day, and he's conscious of the fact that his mother is out there somewhere, and he should really see his mother before it's all over. But he doesn't see eye to eye with his mother, because his mother is a deeply religious person who has tried to convert him time and again, and they don't get on. But he does. He goes and he sees his mother, and it doesn't play out the way he thinks it will with her. Yes, everybody dies at the end of this story. There's no getting around that. That was never in doubt. The world is ending. But it's what two people, one, a mother who brought this person into the world, and him as a child, a man now, almost estranged from her. It's what they do in their final moments that makes this story beautiful. And it's important to me because I was in a situation, the roles were reversed somewhat, but I was in a similar kind of situation where I had watched my own mother get cancer and watched her deteriorate over a period of 1 year. And at the very end, she was in a hospice for the last month or two, and I would be visiting her. And I was always conscious of the fact that at the time I was a Christian, she was not. Was she going to hell? And you know, I would see myself in my mind's eye trying to talk to her about it, and it all seemed so, I don't know, it just, because I didn't even really know that it was true, right? It was just something I'd chosen to believe. I didn't know it was true. I'm one of those more honest Christians, you know what I mean, who is prepared to admit that he has doubts and everything, and he doesn't know everything. But I felt that I had this responsibility somehow to try and get her to become a Christian in her last moments. And it was awful at the very end, because she was drifting in and out of morphine, and when she would drift out, she would drift into unconsciousness. I had to think, well, maybe that's the last time I'm ever going to speak to her and everything. And we could have had a richer last few moments than we did, because all I could do was she kept opening her eyes and saying, "I'm sorry, son." And she meant, "I'm sorry I'm putting you through this." That's what she meant. Such selflessness. But I said, "You have to get right with God, Mom." You know. And she just said, she saw the concern on my face, and she said, "I will, son, I will." And then she drifted off into unconsciousness again, and that was pretty much the last I heard from her ever. And I wish, you know, it's not a big regret or anything, but I kind of look at the hold Christianity had on my life, and it's almost like I allowed this ridiculous thing to poison some poignant moments with my mother at the very end of her life, you know. So that Matheson story plays out a little differently. The mother doesn't go to the son and panic and go, "You have to get right with God, son." It's different. And it makes that a special story for me. Even though the worst thing in the world is happening, the end of the human race is happening. It's such a touching story. It's my favourite Richard Matheson story. And it's the one, I guess, the one story, I guess, that's the one horror story that's the most important to me. Okay, number 6. A non-horror story that you consider horror. Right, there aren't many, but I think this is a legitimate choice. Less Than Zero by Bret Easton Ellis, who's most well known as the author of American Psycho. So I'm kind of running on memory here, but Less Than Zero is really about a bunch of young, privileged Los Angeles people in the 1980s living lives of affluence where everything's done for them. They have their own fancy cars and everything. It's life from one party to the next, drugs everywhere, a feeling of meaninglessness, and that's where the horror is in the story. It's this idea that although we are responsible for all our actions, ultimately there are mitigating factors in our environment that mean we may not turn out to be good people. You know, we've all heard of like kids in really bad places in the world, like maybe certain parts of Africa, being trained to be soldiers, right? A kid in that situation has no chance to turn out well, you know? So you've got like Los Angeles as this monstrous thing in the background that poisons the lives of all these young people, where they're just filled with this emptiness and hopelessness that they're just trying to fill with partying and drugs. And there's not much narrative going on in this novel, and I read it really quick because it was really distasteful to read. I wanted to read it, but I wanted it to be over. You know what I mean? There's a particularly horrible scene in it involving this group of people had got like a 12-year-old girl from somewhere, and they had her tied to the bed and drugged. And the protagonist had enough humanity in him to kind of feel, you know, to feel bad about this situation and want to get out of this situation. But the people he was with, they just kind of went with it, and it got into some nasty territory. But he didn't even, you know, he doesn't even have the humanity to pull that girl out of there and rescue her. He just withdraws himself from it. He's not a hero by any stretch of the imagination. But there's just this feeling, it's just this, I don't know what to call it, but it's like you just have the life sucked out of you because of you know, on the surface you've got everything monetarily, you know, in terms of like, you've got relationships with other people, but it's like this place has just poisoned you. And I think some of the book is autobiographical and based on Bret Easton Ellis's own diaries that he kept. I think it's this book that's the case. Yeah. But yeah, it's a pretty horrific book. I don't think I could ever read it again. I was tempted to put that one as question 1, a horror story that scared or disturbed you. But I couldn't think of any other one to put as an answer to question 6, a non-horror story that you consider horror. So yeah, less than 0. So we're ending on a bit of a downer. But anyway, this was a fun tag. Thank you for tagging me, Michael. Okay. Check the links down below. Oh, I should tag someone as well. And because it's horror, I'm going to tag Redbeard. You did one before, Redbeard, Al. So maybe you'll like to do this one. Okay. Take care, folks.